Hello, today we are going to view some of the most representative examples of art from the most prominent dynasties from the history of China. China has a long and renowned history stretching back thousands of years. This map shows just how big this modern-day country is and how its location gives it access to a number of other nations on the one hand and access to the sea on the other hand. China has traditionally been placed in a significant point of cultural and commercial exchange among different cultures and communities, and has also greatly influenced the development of its neighbors as well. The two long parallel rivers running through the heart of China have allowed communities to flourish in the land between them. With the construction of canals and irrigation systems, Chinese communities have harnessed the power and resources of these major waterways for transportation, agriculture, and more. Although the Chinese have created engineering marvels to support life here on Earth, much of their religious and cultural practices revolve around their concepts of death and the afterlife. Traditionally, Chinese cultures have worshipped ancestors as spirits who continue to exist and impact the lives of their descendants after they've passed. So objects and shrines are created to make space for prayers and offerings to these deceased family members. Many of the objects we have from ancient China were found in tombs, suggesting the importance of protecting and adorning the deceased individual for their journey to the afterlife. In addition to ancestral worship, other formal religions and belief systems have taken hold in China over several hundred years. One of the earliest of these philosophical traditions is Taoism, which means the way, based on the teachings of the philosopher Lao Tzu. The basic tenets of his teachings are the recognition of opposites in the world and the attempt to find a harmonious balance between them. The duality of nature is everywhere, and rather than viewing these forces in opposition to each other, one can view them as necessary balancing factors that complement each other, such as male and female, night and day, sun and moon, life and death, etc. Another early philosophical tradition is Confucianism, based on the teachings of the philosopher Confucius. Confucianism stressed the importance of natural hierarchies in the world and the fulfillment of those hierarchical duties in a just and virtuous manner. Thus, children should defer to and respect their parents, just as subjects should defer to and respect their rulers. But parents and rulers should behave in a way that is fair and just for everyone. Buddhism is a religion that did not originate in China, as Taoism and Confucianism did, but instead traveled east from India along the network of trade routes called the Silk Road, which linked China with its westward neighbors. Buddhism is based on the teachings of the Buddha, born Siddhartha Gautama, who gave up his princely life when he recognized the suffering of the world. Buddhism seeks to end suffering through the practice of non-attachment, meaning non-attachment from the extremes of emotional, physical, and intellectual experiences in order to attain enlightenment, or the highest level of realization. Only then can individuals truly be free from suffering. There are many different ways that we see these three philosophical traditions and religious practices impact the cultural development in China. Generally, the works from ancient China reflect the importance of ancestral worship and the use of objects and offerings in burial. We also see an interest in creating symmetrical and balanced works in both two-dimensional and three-dimensional media, suggesting the importance of duality in nature and life. We also see a mixture of both abstract, stylized forms and highly naturalistic renderings of animals, humans, spiritual figures, and landscapes. We will discuss these in more detail as we move through specific examples for the major dynasties of Chinese history from ancient to early modern time periods. We begin with an object used in funerary ceremonies from the 13th to the 11th centuries BCE in ancient China. This vessel likely held wine that was poured as an offering on altars dedicated to ancestors, or during feasts hosted by the leaders of the Shang dynasty, who were considered to be liaisons between their deceased ancestors and the living. This is created from a technique called separate mold casting, where segments of the vessel are cast into bronze separately before being welded together. There is a long, narrow lid on top of the vessel, for instance, and it bears the shape of a fearsome dragon. The bulging eyes, spiked horns, and bared teeth would intimidate any evil spirits, and the repeating geometric patterns on the surface of the vessel would confuse and disorient any threatening spirits as well. The dragon has long been a symbol of power and good fortune in Chinese art, and it is also thought to symbolize the transformation of the deceased undergoes as they become part of the spirit world in the afterlife. Many historians recognize the Qin dynasty as the beginning of the Chinese Empire and recognize Qin Shi Huangdi as the first emperor of China. Under his leadership, the many different states of China were consolidated under his imperial control and subject to harsh form of governmental rule called legalism. The system required unflinching devotion and obedience to the emperor, and outlawed the teaching and practice of Confucianism. During the short-lived Qin dynasty, many important developments occurred, including the standardization of currency and measurements, and the completion of important infrastructure such as canals and roads. This empire is not known for its cultural development at all, with one major exception. In 1974, the remains of terracotta sculptures were discovered, and further excavation uncovered an enormous complex of burial mounds that made up the large tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. So far, 4 enormous burial pits have been uncovered, with 3 of the 4 filled with thousands of terracotta sculptures that make up a huge army to protect the emperor on his journey to the afterlife and allow his body to remain undisturbed. This army includes dozens of different types of life-size soldiers, horses and chariots, and battle-ready weapons such as spears and crossbows. In addition to these figures, the tomb also contained small models of buildings, with rivers of mercury flowing around them to replicate in miniature the civilization the emperor presided over in life. It's also thought that precious stones dotted the inside roofs of the pits to create the illusion of the night sky shimmering with stars above. Other pits that appear to be unfinished contain more terracotta sculptures of entertainers, such as acrobats, dancers, and musicians, perhaps to perform for the delight of the emperor or celebrate his journey into the afterlife. A closer view of the soldiers reveals some of their most notable characteristics. At first glance, they appear to be identical forms, but closer examination shows slight but important variations. The hairstyles, facial hair, even the shapes of the noses, eyes, and ears all reflect certain types of people, thought to represent the different ethnicities represented or likely conscripted in the emperor's army once the various regions of China were unified. It would have been an impossible task to have one individual artist create a full soldier from head to toe and be able to produce so many of them in only one lifetime. What we see here is the product of a sophisticated system of highly controlled workers who are responsible for producing specific elements of the objects contained in the tomb. These soldiers were also made from separate mold casting, meaning that several pieces of the same type could be made over and over again very quickly, then assembled and fired together. As impressive as these sculptures are, it is hard to overlook the strict and punishing conditions that must have accompanied their creation, as individual workers were forced to sign their work to ensure accountability for mistakes, and even report on the failings of other workers within their groups. Just as in life, even in death, the first emperor of China was putting fear and obedience as his top priority. The borders created under the Qin dynasty were maintained during the dynasty that followed after a short period of civil war, called the Han dynasty. In stark contrast to the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty is characterized by cultural development, with creative practices such as poetry, literature, and silk painting flourishing alongside philosophy and history. Confucianism was brought back, serving as the standard for both individual behavior and educational instruction. Another object from the tomb of a wealthy individual gives us a good example of the artistic achievements of the Han dynasty. Found laying on top of the innermost coffin of 4 coffins nested one inside of the other, this silk banner depicts the wealthy wife of the Marquis of Dai, known as Lady Dai, during her journey to the afterlife. Lady Dai died in 163 BCE, the same year her son died, and the coffins of her son, and her husband were discovered together in 1972. The banner is in the shape of a T and is split into 3 horizontal registers of activity, with winding patterns of decorative lines and animals leading from one to the other. Clearly, the Dai family was wealthy, if Lady Dai received not 1 but 4 coffins, and this beautiful imagery was painted on top of silk, a soft, smooth, and precious fabric that only the elites could afford. At the very bottom of the banner is a collection of individuals mourning the death of Lady Dai as they offer containers of food and wine in front of her wrapped dead body. The platform they sit on is held up by a large semi-naked male figure and surrounded by birds, fish, and other animal forms. In the central register is an image of Lady Dai herself, which we will return to for a closer look on the next slide. And at the very top of the banner is the heavenly realm, where 2 figures bend toward each other to greet the new spirit joining them, as the bodies of 2 dragons wind in S shapes above. A frog balances on a crescent moon in the upper left corner, and a bird is silhouetted against a bright red sun in the upper right corner. All around these forms are swirling motifs of vines and flowers and other animals decorating the surface, leaving very little space unadorned. Let's take a closer look at the portrait of Lady Dai herself in the central section of the banner. In the middle is Lady Dai, standing in the center of a white platform and shown dressed in a beautifully patterned silk and leaning on a cane. She appears to be surrounded by her attendants, lined up behind her and kneeling before her. This may be the moment when Lady Dai leaves this world and journeys to the next. We can see birds hovering above, and the heads of dragons on the left and the right, symbols of these powerful, mythical beasts that bring good fortune and prosperity. The bright reds and whites are still surprisingly vibrant for its age, and the thoughtful arrangement of colors and forms allows us to join Lady Dai on her journey upwards from this world to the next. It took about 300 years after the collapse of the Han dynasty before another prominent dynasty unified China again, and shortly after a short-lived political establishment under the Sui dynasty, the Tang dynasty took control. The Tang dynasty is known for economic growth, with the expansion of territory and trading networks among China and other nations. Known as the Golden Age of Chinese civilization, There is also a cultural expansion during this time, as different forms of art flourished thanks to economic prosperity, political stability, and the influence of various cultural and religious ideas characterizing the cosmopolitan capital city. Thanks to the commercial and economic exchange taking place along the networks and routes collectively known as the Silk Road, the teachings of Buddhism spread east to China. As such, we see an increase in artworks depicting the various narratives and figures associated with Buddhist beliefs during this time. This beautiful painted silk piece is a fragment of a hanging scroll depicting a bodhisattva known as Guan Yin in China. A bodhisattva is an individual who has the ability to reach enlightenment, but has chosen to delay enlightenment out of compassion for others. Instead of reaching enlightenment for themselves, they guide others in their journeys to enlightenment. So often a bodhisattva, or Guan Yin, is showing leading another individual. The bodhisattva here is a large and prominent figure in this space, indicating its higher spiritual status with hierarchical scale. The layers of fabric displaying a wide array of colors and patterns, as well as the concentric colored circles creating a halo around its head, give the bodhisattva an aristocratic air. It's difficult to tell whether this spiritual figure is a male or female, as if it exists in a world beyond the trappings of humanity, such as sex and gender. It holds a censer, an object for incense, in its right hand, and a white banner on a pole in its left hand, brandishing the objects used to help guide the smaller soul pictured in red along the path trailing behind. The building in the upper left corner symbolizes the Pure Land, the paradisical destination for enlightened souls. Viewers of this sumptuous scroll painting can easily see the contrast between the elegant, enlightened individual and the smaller, meeker woman following along the bodhisattva's smoke-like wake. Scroll painting was, of course, not invented during the Song dynasty, which technically is divided into the Northern Song and Southern Song political rules. However, it is this medium that best characterizes the artistic preferences during these centuries. Under the Song dynasty, a specific form of painting emerged from the official court, guided by the standards and tastes of the Imperial Painting Academy, which tended to prefer highly naturalistic renderings of the environment. A rise of the merchant class, who benefited from the bustling trade networks and commercial opportunities presented by the imperial court, created a new audience of art buyers who were interested in collecting scenes of nature and everyday life. Under the Song dynasty, instruction in the finest art forms was a high priority. Known as the Three Perfections, the arts of calligraphy, painting, and poetry were often intertwined in artworks. These encouraged viewers to contemplate the meanings and lessons found in close observation of nature, and thoughtful introspection and personal reflection on one's own life as well. The scroll paintings paired beautiful scripts of lyrical text with highly naturalistic and intricately detailed visions of the natural world, giving viewers a chance to slow down and appreciate the beauty before them. Especially under the Northern Song dynasty, monumental landscape painting flourished. Images of immense landscapes that dwarf any presence or assemblage of humans were typical, recalling the many Chinese who chose to retreat into the cavernous mountainsides and cliffsides. In this image, the artist Li Cheng gives us a highly detailed environment. The title of the painting suggests that the main subject matter is a religious temple. However, the temple itself may be challenging to find amid the sweeping view of cliffs, trees, and even waterfalls. If we begin at the top of the scroll, we see a craggy peak that sweeps down at a sharp and treacherous angle. Our eyes can take in every twist and turn of the hillside, with a tremendous rendering of light and shadow in just the black ink. On the left side and the right, if we look closely, we can detect waterfalls pouring down from the cliffs, and the small pagoda roof temple sits quietly in the center. Below the solitary temple are twisted trees that resemble talons or thorns, as if one would have to make their way through unwieldy spikes to reach the sacred spot. A small collection of structures dots the bottom center of the landscape, seeming pretty small and insignificant compared to the powerful, towering mountains above. The last dynasty we will discuss is the Ming Dynasty, which means bright or brilliant. The Ming Dynasty capitalized on the weakness of the Mongols to the north, solidifying a return to traditional Chinese cultural traditions. Although the Ming Dynasty continued the traditions set by the formal academies and courts of painting and other art forms, we also see during this time the inclusion of individual qualities that help identify the unique approaches and preferences of specific artists. Even so, the influences of neighboring cultures and the expanding connections with civilizations further west, in addition to the legacy left by the Mongols, encourages new artistic styles and media. The Ming Dynasty is probably best known for its blue and white porcelain vases. Porcelain began to rise in prominence alongside painting as a desirable and collectible art form during this time. Large and small ceramic objects appeared during the porcelain production, bearing designs of flowers, waves, vegetal, and scroll motifs. These enormous works of ceramic utilized a white underglaze and blue pigment made of cobalt. These twin Ming vases display the familiar dragon symbols, with their fearsome heads characterized by pointed horns, a large snout, and bulging eyes. Their claws are also clearly visible hovering above their heads, and their bodies twist and undulate around the round form of the vase. Decorative patterns and other fearsome faces fill the spaces below and above the dragons. Although there are many art forms that can represent the long artistic traditions in China, the Ming vases are likely some of the most recognizable, thanks to their extreme popularity among collectors and aristocrats around the world. Royal courts from the Middle East to Europe were filled with collectors of these precious objects, which also means there are many fakes on the market still. Supposedly, an authentic Ming vase will have a warm, gong-like sound when struck. However, I don't recommend going around and striking any that you see in the near future. This concludes our overview of the arts from China.